Hope you all have a most blessed weekend. I just want to influence the youth today, young adults, mature adults. If you want to better your diversity in, education, you want to change your job because of your health. Um, even mothers that are giving birth, pregnant in pregnancy, they want to change their job, make it more beneficial to be studying why their children bring up their children. Anyway, understanding politics, ideas, and institutions in the modern world. Module DD 211. Make sure you record your readings. Reference your reading. Understanding politics, ideas, and institutions in the modern world. Book 1 is edited by Geoff Andrews, Andrew Sajaki, Andy O'Kane, Ray Prokovinik, and Dan Taylor. The book is published at the Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, MK76AA. First published 2015, second edition 2022. Copyright by Open University. Page 77, where we left off. The spaces of politics. The Senedd Suamu, Welsh Parliament, asks most people where politics is done, and the first place they will probably think of is a place where politicians make policies and laws. A legislative space. Regardless of where you are from, you'll probably be able to point to a building or cluster of buildings where politics is done. The Palace of Westminster, which houses the UK Parliament, the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, the German Bundestag in Berlin, or in Grand National Assembly of Turkey in Ankara. The people in those buildings may or may not be democratically elected. They may or may not represent the interests of their constituents. They may not all have an equal say in matters of law or policy. But no matter where you're from and what form of government prevails there, you probably have a sense of legislative space where politics, at least in the narrow sense of the term, is done and from which it emanates. Before the creation of the Scottish and Welsh Parliament, and later the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland, the Palace of Westminster in London was a focus on legislative activity in the UK, following Scottish and Welsh devolution. That is no longer the case. Welsh politics is increasingly guided by the Senedd Suamu, Welsh Parliament, which has become an increasingly important legislative space for the 4.8% of the UK citizens who are Welsh. The Senedd is comprised of 60 members. As or Alidawa, or Senedd in Welsh, who as of 2011 are elected every 5 years. A November 2021 agreement between Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, would see the expansion of the Senedd from 60 to between 80 and 100 members. The establishment of the Senedd, known until 2020 as the National Assembly for Wales, was supported by a very narrow margin in the 1997 referendum. The Yes campaign secured 50.1% of the vote in turnout of just 50.1% of the electorate. A positive vote on a second referendum in 2011 saw the Senedd given additional powers to make and implement laws into policy areas such as culture, economic development, education and training, the environment, health services, highways and transport, housing, local government, social services, tourism, town and country planning, and the Welsh language. Need a pen. The physical location of the legislative power is highly symbolic. During the revolutions, the taking of legislative space is often primarily an indicator of who is in control. We invest these legislative spaces and the bricks and mortar of physical structures that house them with significance, and it is this that makes them important spaces of politics. The physical space of the Senedd has itself been invested with a lot of symbolism. The use of indigenous materials and labour speaks to the Welsh character of space. Natural ventilation and rainwater harvesting are used to ensure the building is environmentally sustainable. The glass front symbolises the openness, transparency, and accessibility to the legislative space, values that the Welsh democracy hopes to protect. The design of the internal space of the Parliamentary Assembly is meant to represent the openness of the accountability of the Welsh democracy. This Sumarbury, the chamber, is a circle in design so that all members can see each other, with the architecture of the space meant to make the democratic process less confrontational. In keeping with its goal of openness and exclusivity, the Synod has a dual language policy, as can speak either Welsh, Sumig, or English in a Symbia, and during the committee meetings and simultaneously translation is provided. The use of Welsh in the Synod is again meant to symbolise the exclusiveness, as the 1/5 of the Welsh population who speak Sumig can now hear their language validated in a legislative space. In fact, one of the first laws to be paused after the then National Assembly for Wales gained legislative powers was the Welsh language measure of 2011, which gave Sumig official status in Wales. While in one sense the Synod is just a building in which legislative policy is done, it is also, in another sense, much more than the physical materials for which it is made. This legislative space is designed to showcase Wales as an environmentally conscious, forward-thinking and exclusive democracy, and represents the aspiration for Wales to be a more modern country, with modern legislative chamber and a political space designed to capture the best of its democratic impulse. As you saw when you examined the various definitions of politics in the first chapter, even according to the more narrow definitions, parliamentary politics extended beyond space such as Westminster. They extended outwards to the spaces such as Synod, to the workplaces, living rooms and dinner tables of ordinary citizens where heated political discussions take place. And discussions on who to vote for are often made. To the polling stations where ballots are cast, and to the officers of pressure groups that organise opinion and try to lobby governments. Thus, while Westminster and Cardiff remain imposing an important space of politics, where representatives elected by the people deliberate on behalf of the people, their political might is fueled by scores of other, more modest and often less visible spaces where politics is done. The Supreme Court of the United States. Courtrooms tend to be places where criminal and civil law is enacted by lawyers, judges, and juries. Under certain circumstances, however, the judicial spaces, such as courtrooms, can be political spaces, with judges become political actors who make political decisions. One such space is the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, beyond which no recourse is possible. The Supreme Court is housed in the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. The building itself is vested with considerable symbolic value, designed on a scale to keep in this important dignity of the court and judiciary of the co-equal independent branch of the United States government, and as a symbolic of the national ideal of justice in a higher sphere of activity. Supreme Court of United States, no date. The steps to the main entrance are flagged by two statues, a female figure representing justice and a male figure representing the authority of law. Inscribed above the main entrance is the motto, equal justice under law. Like other courts, the Supreme Court enforces law, but it also serves as a constitutional court charged with upholding and interpreting the Constitution of the United States. The United States has fixed constitution drawn up in 1787 and amended 28 times since. That inhumates the rights of US citizens and prevents successive governments from limiting or restricting these rights. The Supreme Court is charged with enforcing the rights set out in the Constitution and ensuring that these rights and the political rules establishing the system of the government set out in the Constitution are not curtailed by anyone, including the US President and Congress, the legislator comprising the Senate and the Housing of the Representatives. Although the Constitution can be amended, such amendments can only be proposed by a 66% majority of both House of Congress, and for much amendments to be ratified, the agreement of 75% of the 50 states, which is required. The Supreme Court, though obliged to enforce the Constitution as and when amended, has itself no say in the process of amendment. The court comprises 9 individuals who are nominated by the President and whose appointment is ratified by the US Senate, the upper house of Congress, to which each of the 50 states elect 2 representatives. One placed on the court, justice cannot be removed from the court, save the exceptional case that they commit an impeachable high crime or misdemeanor, as determined by an upper majority, 2/3 of Congress. What is more, no justice can be instructed by anyone to take particular decisions. Justices try cases and listen to the evidence placed before them by lawyers and witnesses, but the Supreme Court is wholly independent of every other federal or state institution in the country. Supreme Court justices are not political in the sense of partisan that is attached to a specific party. They may be considered liberal or conservative in the terms of the way in which they interpret the meaning of the Constitution and the intentions of its framers. But they are not tied to either the Republican or the Democratic Party. The opinion of the court as to what is and what is not constitutional is determined by the majority of the court, sometimes by a small majority of 5 to 4 justices. The Supreme Court and its justices are responsible for upholding the rights of the people as are set out in the Constitution. In doing that, however, justices are entitled to make their own individual interpretation of the rights that the Constitution establishes. Thus, if 5 of the 9 justices agree on particular interpretation of the Constitution, then the Supreme Court in effect establishes what constitutional rights are provided by the Constitution. As the ultimate custodian of the US Constitution, the court's interpretation of constitutional rights is the final word on how the rights provided for by the Constitution are interpreted. Take, for instance, the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, which asserts that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, as it is a constitutional right for US citizens to keep and bear arms. The Supreme Court cannot permit the President, Congress, or any other authority to completely ban the ownership of firearms. However, it does have the final word on how that right is interpreted. In the case of debates on women's right to an abortion, a right that is not spelled out in the Constitution, successive Supreme Courts have thus far interpreted the right to privacy established under the 14th Amendment as enabling abortion to be made legal. However, with a recent change in the Supreme Court's composition, 6 of the 9 justices lean to the right, with 3 having been appointed during Donald Trump's presidency, Glenza. Many think that the right to abortion is now under significant threat. Being charged with interpreting and enforcing the Constitution, the Supreme Court can also strike down, that is, declare unconstitutional and therefore null and void, laws enacted by the President and Congress. Neither the federal executive, the President, nor the legislative Congress can overrule Supreme Court decisions. In the UK, by contrast, the political system ensures that no court can strike down legislation passed by the UK Parliament, but the judiciary can merely apply it to or interpret it where Parliament's intention is unclear or contradictory. Thus, alongside the federal executive and the legislature, the judiciary, the Supreme Court, and the lower courts that are subordinate to it is a political space in its own right. The ancient Athenian Agora, although taken a leap back into the unfamiliar territory of ancient Athens, might seem a bit peculiar. Ancient Athens has been crucial to contemporary Western understandings of politics. For most contemporary political theorists, the worlds of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle have marked the dawn of the Western political tradition and the origins of contemporary democracy. The ancient Athenian Agora, the centre of political and public life in ancient Athens, was actually quite different from the contemporary legislative judicial spaces where politics is done. However, as the case with contemporary legislative and judicial spaces such as the Senate and the US Supreme Court, the Agora was fuelled and indeed surrounded by scores of other spaces where politics was done. As a physical space, the Agora was very different from what you might imagine. Our historical imaginations are often coloured by contemporary experiences. Consequently, the knowledge that the Agora served as a meeting place for the assemblies of citizens involved in matters of legislation, that is, matters related to the passing of laws, might lead us to imagine it is an assembly in the chambers of the modern parliaments of assemblies. In fact, ancient Greek Agora, of which the Athenian Agora was one prominent example, were large multifunctional spaces akin to contemporary town squares where all manner of activities took place. The Athenian Agora, for instance, was used not only for legislative assemblies but also for the commerce. It served as a marketplace and religious, sport, and military and judicial activities. Thus, in some ways, the worlds of legislative politics and jurisprudence were less spatially segregated from other activities than they are today. In other ways, the world of political politics was much further removed from the lives of ordinary Athenians. That is, from most of our lives, for instance. The right to participate in the assembly and thus have a say in the laws governing the city was restricted to a small portion of Athenian citizenry, although the boundaries of Athenian citizenship were encountered, expanded and contracting over time. They never included more than a tiny portion of the male population of Athens, women, enslaved people, merchants and metics, residents, migrants who had some of the obligations but none of the rights of citizens, had no access to the assembly, and even the participation of male citizens was highly regulated. While contemporary notions of the citizenship are grounded in the principle that all citizens are equal, at least theoretically or formally, such was not the case in ancient Athens. Citizen rights, such as the right to participate in assembly, and obligations such as the payment of taxes and the performance of military service, depending on the category of citizens to which one belonged. Thus, despite its portrayal as a cradle of Western political tradition, and particularly Western democracy, the Athenian Agora bears little resemblance to contemporary spaces where politics, as that which concerns the state, is done. Yet, if we don't narrow the definition of politics to that which concerns the state or city-state, in ancient Athens times, the number of political actors and spaces of politics in ancient Athens multiplies, just as it does in contemporary times. The ancient Athenian household, for instance, was also a site of political activity. The men's quarters were often sites of symposia, the Greek sympinon, or to drink together. Eating and drinking were accompanied by music, poetry, and lively political and philosophical discussions. Although women did not participate in symposia and, you saw above, had limited access to the agora, they were political actors in their own right, engaging not only in politics of the household, but also in the politics of the city-state. As historian Michael Scott has noted, fueled by the rapid evolution in the roles of women in modern society, historians have taken a fresh look at women in ancient Greece. The result has been a change in the depth and nature of understanding of them. the range of female influence and experience has slowly been brought to the fore. From the divine power of the female gods to the social and religious power of the female priests, from the model women of Homer to the anti-heroines of myth and drama, from women who were the power behind the throne to those who wore the crown themselves, from female enforced prostitution to female authored sex manuals and poems of literary genius. While politics in our sense of the term was certainly being done by some, Athenian men in the space of the Agora, politics in a broader sense of the term was also being done by other actors in other places. Thus, while the ancient Athenian Agora is often figured as the birthplace of the Western political tradition, it was just one among the many spaces where politics was done in ancient Greece. The Sultan's court at Harem. The courts of harems, the Ottoman Empire, 1453-1923, provide another excellent example of the manner in which the most private and supposedly apolitical of spaces could be teeming with the political activity during his heyday. The Ottoman Empire extended from the North Africa, across the Red and Black Seas, through southeastern Europe and into the Balkans. Ruled by successive sultans, the empire's political affairs were attended in places and varying sizes where street division existed between spaces in which politics was done. The Sultan's court and domestic or private spaces, the harem or the private household quarters, over which women presided and from which politics was supposedly absent. In the harem, the Orientalist, the painting by Frederick Arthur Bridgman. Orientalism was a style of painting that purported to depict what was known in Europe as the Near and Far East, though it rarely showed the reality of life in those parts of the world. The Topkapı Palace in present-day Istanbul, Turkey, was no exception. The palace, which served as the imperial residence and the seat of the government for much of the empire's history, comprised a sultan's court where politics was officially done, and a harem, the private sphere, was a sultan's family resided in the imaginations of Oriental artists and travellers, writers. The harem was a space of dancing, debauchery, and exotic pleasure. Orientalism refers to a particular style of depicting the Orient. The area now commonly referred to as the Middle East in North Africa, writing and visual art. It has been a seriously critic, including the most famous by Edward Said, 1978, for its inaccurate colonial representations. More serious writers, however, have pointed to the fact that the harem was actually a highly political space and one in which women whose role in politics is never formally acknowledged, where they primarily political actors. The harem stood physically adjacent to the various halls that comprised the Sultan's court. Among the most important courtrooms were the Imperial Council and the Audience Chamber. The Imperial Council was by the meeting of the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's closest advisor, ministers and other high-ranking officers of the empire. The Sultan would be briefed on the content of these meetings in the audience chamber, where he could also receive foreign dignitaries and decide on domestic and foreign affairs. It was in the spaces of the Imperial Council and the audience chamber that politics was officially done, and from which the empire and its foreign affairs were governed. At the end of the day, the Sultan retired to the harem, where he spent time with his family and combines indulging in music and poetry and leaving the spaces of politics behind. This neat division of space into public and private, political and apolitical, though tempting in its simplicity, has little to do with the reality of the harem. The harem itself is a highly politicised space. First, the manner in which space was organised and allocated in the harem was highly political and determined the level of influence a woman had over both the harem and the sultan. Those with chambers in close proximity to the sultan's private chamber had greater access to the sultan, and thus greater influence on the affairs of the state. The stakes were high, and the matter who received which chambers was to the object of great struggle in the harem. The issue of marriage was also highly politicised in the harem, as it was as it also in the households of royalty and political elite in Europe and elsewhere. If not chosen by the Sultan as one of the con- concubines, some of the women of the imperial harem would marry high-ranking ministers and officers of the empire. Though their various marriages, they create a political network that extended outward from the Sultan's harem and into the various ministries of the empire. The importance of the network and the political power that could be wielded through it meant that the women favoured and trusted by those in positions of power in the harem were promoted to marry certain officers. Their marriages provided the women of the harem with access to the political capital of the officers and gave them a greater opportunity to influence the government of the empire. The politics of the harem extended also to children inhibited to space, particularly the offspring of the sultan. Young princes were often encouraged to kill their siblings to safeguard against the possibility of a struggle for the throne. Not only was political assassination a regular occurrence in the harem, but a struggle was also waged by mothers to secure the favour of the sultan for their male children. Among the best known examples of political influence that could be gained through the harem was influence acquired by Harem Sultan, 1500s to 1558, one of the most powerful women in history of the Ottoman Empire. She arrived at the court in Suleiman, the Magnificent, as an enslaved woman, but rose to become his favourite concubine and then his wife. Having acquired immense political power in the harem Sultan ensured that one of her sons sat on the throne of the empire. She is remembered as one of the most prominent figures of an emir, known as a Sultanate of the Women, a period for the 16th to the 18th century during which the women of the harem were said to exercise tremendous influence over politics of the empire. The formal decision of space into the space of Sultan's court where politics was done, and the space of the harem, a private sanctum removed from the world of politics, and nothing more than that, a formal decision with little relationship to reality. In reality, the private space of the harem was a space in which and through which politics was done, and done by women, who, despite not being recognised as such, were in fact central political actors where we define politics narrowly, and that which concerns the state, or more broadly as, say, the exercise of power. There was no lack of politics in what was supposed to be almost political of all spaces, and among those considered to be some of the most political of all actors, women and children. Page 88. The politics of space. As you have seen, politics is done in both the most obvious and the most unexpected of places. It is done in space specifically designated as political, legislative places such as the buildings of parliaments, the ancient agora, or the council chamber of kings, emperors, or sultan. Is done in less obvious political but still relatively public and transparent judicial spaces such as the US Supreme Court. However, politics is also done in more unexpected places, and by those seldom recognised as political actors. It is done at the kitchen tables and in sitting rooms of Birmingham, as it was done in the Afghan households and the harems of the Ottoman Empire, as political theorist Judith Butler observed, referring to the relationship between politics and space articulated by Hannah Arendt. Political space is transposable. Politics, in other words, can appear anywhere, and in appearing transforms a space into a space of politics. It is action and speech that create a political space between the participants, which can find its proper location almost anywhere and any time. Arendt, 1998. thus enacting politically somewhere, we bring into being a space of politics. The space in which we do politics are themselves not neutral canvases, blank slates, empty stages, or mere backdrops against which politics is enacted. Space itself is also already political. It is never just there, thus, as was alluded to at the beginning of the chapter, an analysis of where politics is done, which we undertook in a previous section by pointing to the existence of various spaces of politics, must be complemented by an analysis of the politics of space. Such analysis might include asking about the manner in which power and politics are exercised through the arrangement of space, about the activities that particular spaces enable or disable, about the contest over the use of the allocation of particular spaces. Let's look at some of these questions for example that might make those rather abstract notions more concrete and help us understand how contests over space are enacted. Politics of squares because of the potential for power exercised through space. Contests over allocation, distribution, and use of space are pivotal, if not always visible. Politics struggles. Among the more visible of such contests was the worldwide Occupy movement. Occupy began to international headlines in September 2011 with its attempts to redefine particular spaces, including public parks and squares. As space of politics and resistance of political and economic oppression, although the movement lost momentum in February, it dissolved into another political movements around the world, many of which continued to use a tactic of politicising and occupying public spaces to bring attention not only to the political space but also to other political issues. Occupy began as a movement to draw attention to the unequal distribution of social, political, and economic benefits across the globe, which many protesters saw as the result of the power and practices of the large corporations and global financial capital. The movement began on 17th of September, when 200 or so protesters marched down Wall Street in New York, the symbolic heart of the global financial capital, and spent the night campaigning out in Sokoto Park, a few blocks north of Wall Street. By October, Occupy movements had sprung up across the United States and in dozens of other countries, with protesters occupying squares, parks, and other public spaces. Clashes with police who tried to clear protesters in their camps for these spaces ensued, and by the end of the year, only 2 protest camps remained, one in Washington, D.C., and the other in London. Both were cleared by mid-February. Although it was short-lived, and thus, according to some, a failure, the Occupy movement made a lasting contribution to debates about the use and allocation of space, and to debates about the physical and metaphorical visibility and invisibility of certain groups in contemporary politics. Using the slogan, "We are the 99%," the movement attempted to draw attention to the unequal global distribution of resources, whereby the 1% own more wealth than the 99% put together, to the invisibility, both metaphorical and actual, of the 99% in spaces of economic and political power, and to the inability of 99% to access, yet effectively engage those spaces of power. That is all for this morning's reading. Take care and one love. Speak soon.